I'm Rakesh Patry, Director General of International Labour Affairs for Employment and Social Development Canada. It is really a pleasure and an honor for me personally and for the Government of Canada to be taking on this role. I think what has really prompted us to take this initiative is addressing the gender wage gap is and really will continue to be a priority for Canada, both domestically and internationally. And by taking on this role, we really hope that we can share some of our experience from working on this issue for many years, learn some best practices from others, bring new partners on board to grow the coalition, and generally build awareness on the importance of addressing the gender wage gap globally. In Canada, we've had two major initiatives that have come into force in this past year, which we think have really been instructive and helped deliver progress on closing this gap. The first is new trade pay transparency measures that require affected federally regulated employers in Canada to report their salary data and aggregate pay gap information. And this pay gap reporting, it's important to note, will really go beyond gender. Canada is going to be the first country in the world to make available to the public various pay gaps, whether they be hourly wage gaps, bonus pay gaps, overtime pay gaps, that affect not just women, but also Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, and members of visible minorities. The second initiative that we're introducing is the Pay Equity Act, which requires federally regulated employers to take proactive steps to ensure that they're providing equal pay to men and women doing work of equal value. This is being administered and enforced by our new Federal Pay Equity Commissioner, and the new regime will ensure that pay equity is achieved and maintained, and really will contribute to reducing the gender wage gap by addressing the portion of the gap due to undervaluation of work that is done by women. And these initiatives have really taught us the importance of engaging with all stakeholders, including particularly the private sector. Government, workers, unions, employers really need to continue to work together to ensure that everyone has a fair and equal chance to succeed. And as we're all aware, underlying the ILO's work is the concept of tripartitism and social dialogue. And we believe that the dialogue and cooperation among and between governments and those two social partners, employer and worker organizations, really promotes consensus building and the democratic involvement of those involved in the vital states in the world of work. And so we really think that EPIC fits the bill on these fronts and meshes with the importance that Canada places on this issue. And so we hope that we can contribute in some small way to reducing that gender wage gap, both domestically and globally. Well, I have a great deal to say to Sylvie, and all of it is appreciation and admiration. Sylvie Douret and the Swiss government really were leaders in building EPIC, along with the Secretariat, the work of the ILO and the OECD and UN Women. But her role and the Swiss government's role in launching EPIC and putting in place the building blocks for what is today a strong and flourishing coalition was really vital. And so she has set a high standard and a high bar for all of us to follow and to achieve. So my sincere thanks to her for making the coalition really known on the international scene. And in particular, the Swiss government and Sylvie have done a great job of putting forward best practices that have been undertaken by the Swiss government. In particular, their standard analysis tool that enables employers to conduct their own equal pay analysis, LOGIP, I believe it's called. And I think this is really an example of the work that EPIC has set out to do, this sharing of best practices that Sylvie and the Swiss government have had a high standard for. So I'm certainly pleased that she personally and the Swiss government are going to continue to be engaged and involved in EPIC, because we need their expertise to continue to build awareness of the importance of this issue. While women are clearly the group that is most disproportionately impacted by the gender wage gap issue, the reality is that this should not be an issue that is left to women to fight alone. This is an issue that all genders need to be engaged and involved in. Women have been making their voices loudly heard for a while now on this issue, and the reality is the gender wage gap has not been reduced at the pace that it should be and needs to be. And it takes all groups to work on this issue because it is not a women's issue. It is a human rights issue. It is a workplace issue. And it is fundamentally also an economic issue. Pay equity is not just the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do. And when workers can count on equal pay for work of equal value, our economy grows stronger, labor force participation, particularly by women, grows stronger. And so I think it's critical for men to be involved in this discussion and to show allyship with women in addressing this issue. And so I don't see myself as being a leader on this issue, or men in general as being leaders in debating this issue. It is a question of all genders and all sectors of society working together in tackling this issue. Well, I think the big value that EPIC brings to this debate and this discussion is the awareness that it builds and the dialogue that it creates to help us to find solutions. And I think certainly our priority for Canada as we work within the context of EPIC is going to be to build on what has been done before and to ensure that EPIC continues to, first and foremost, really help build awareness on pay equity and pay transparency on the international scene, to share good practices and access to sound data, to assist members, whether they be governments or employers, with policy development if required. And I think this part is critical to ensure that we have greater engagement from the private sector in EPIC. The private sector clearly needs to be a part of the solution here, and we're pleased that so many global employers have chosen to join EPIC, and we look forward to building that representation and continuing to work with them on sharing best practices and solutions to reduce the gender wage gap. I think COVID has really set us back quite a bit in the efforts that have been made in many years, just around labor standards in general, including addressing the equal pay gap. But what we've seen happening with COVID has been the most vulnerable communities have been the ones that have been the most disproportionately impacted by COVID. And that applies to issues such as work within global supply chains, to violence and harassment issues, and of course to equal pay. And I think tragically, what we've seen happening through COVID is longstanding gender inequities have really only been amplified over the course of the pandemic and have put really decades of hard fought gains for women in the workplace now at risk. But if there is any silver lining to this, it is the type of discussion that we're having now. And hopefully the pandemic and these kinds of discussions will put greater awareness on the need for governments, workers, employer organizations to really address gender inequality in the world of work and to address it now. These discussions must continue to be held between all of the relevant stakeholders. And it is critical for us to share best practices, to build awareness of these issues, and to develop cooperatively initiatives that can continue to be implemented. And I think this is really where EPIC has a key role to play. And a possible example related to pay equity on this is domestically here within Canada. Despite the constraints that COVID placed on employers and businesses over the past year and a half, we had our pay equity commissioner here in Canada conduct roundtable discussions in the lead up to our Pay Equity Act coming into force in August of 2021. And despite the restraints and the challenges that COVID placed on this, we still saw significant participation from businesses, from employers, and from industry leaders leading up to that initiative. And we hope that that is an example of the kind of work that can be done globally as everyone comes together to, as we hopefully emerge from the pandemic, build back better, build back stronger, and ensure that some of these regressions are addressed. Well, to put it simply, I would say set an example and set a high bar or a standard for others to follow. I think what employers and workers organizations and governments can do is examine their human resources and pay practices and policies, and just quite simply make sure that you're paying your employees fair wages. Employers could analyze their compensation practices, develop data, and look closely at that data on employees' pay across organizations. And going back to what I was saying before about data and about best practices, collect and share data on wages and pay practices with your employees, and if possible, share that data publicly. Also, with respect to sharing of best practices, which I really see as a key component of the Equal Pay International Coalition, is share those best practices as broadly as you possibly can. Um, one of the groups that really can use assistance with this are small and medium-sized enterprises. Large corporations, multinational enterprises have sophisticated human resource departments or consultants to help guide them. SMEs don't always have access to that. And I think the sharing of best practices that major corporations put in place or governments put in place to tackle these issues, the idea of EPIC is that this kind of information can be disseminated broadly, can be shared, and it helps smaller employers to develop those tools and to put those into practice. Well, my initial response to that, Kevin, is I think it was an experience that at first was challenging, frustrating, and exhausting. But in the end, as I look back on it, it was an experience that was perhaps one of the most rewarding of my professional career. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of ILO Convention 190. This is the first international treaty dealing with issues of violence and harassment in the world of work. And I think it's unfortunate that it has taken the global community as long as it has to get to the point of having an international treaty dealing with this issue. But it is timely, and it is all the more timely now, as I noted, emerging from the pandemic, where you're seeing different communities more at risk of suffering from violence and harassment in the world of work. And what Convention 190 really does is provide that framework or those guidelines for legislation in different countries and for practices to be put in place by employers to ensure that we are providing protection against violence and harassment in the world of work. But I think the other thing that I want to touch on, Kevin, is besides the importance of the text and substance that is in Convention 190, it is the fact that Convention 190, I think, was an indicator of the importance of tripartitism, of social dialogue, and of multilateralism. And I think what we are seeing today is often an attack on multilateralism or questions around whether it still works. And I think what Convention 190 has demonstrated is that it is still possible for tripartite solutions to these issues, for employers, worker organizations, and governments to come together to tackle a really difficult and contentious issue and come up with a solution to it. And the fact that this can be done through multilateral systems like the ILO, I think is absolutely critical. Canada is a strong believer and defender in a multilateral rules-based international order. And I think this demonstrates that we can tackle some of society's major problems through these multilateral institutions and through tripartite social dialogue solutions by bringing employers and worker organizations into that discussion as well. And I hope Convention 190 winds up being an example to not just address issues of violence and harassment in the world of work, but to show that there can be multilateral solutions to these issues as well.